Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Mary Frances O'Connor and Meghan Riordan Jarvis. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Mary Frances O'Connor is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab known as the GLASS Lab, which investigates the effects of grief on the brain and body. She is the author of the 2022 book, The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss, and we hosted an event with Mary Frances back when it was first published. Professor O'Connor's research focuses on the physiological correlates of emotion, in particular, the wide range of physical and emotional responses during bereavement, including yearning and isolation. Joining her is Meghan Riordan Jarvis, a psychotherapist, author, host of the podcast Grief is My Side Hustle. I love that title. Two-time TEDx speaker, educator, corporate consultant, and sought-after keynote speaker. She does it all, specializing in trauma and grief and loss. Ms. Jarvis founded the Grieftastic Book Fair and is on the board of the William Wentz Center for Loss and Healing. She's the author of two books, 2024's Can Anyone Tell Me? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss, and a memoir about her personal experience with PTSD after the deaths of her parents, End of the Hour, published in 2023. And now I'm thrilled to welcome Mary Frances O'Connor and Meghan Riordan Jarvis to FAN.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. It is wonderful to be back and good to see you, Meghan.
Oh, it is so good to see you. Thank you so much to the fan community for inviting me. It's very corny to say, a big fan of your programming, and anything that gets me to talk to my friend and colleague and mentor, Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, is just an absolute pleasure and honor for me.
This will be a great conversation.
Well, I have a million questions, and I want to start us for today. I want to start us, if you don't mind, talking about your daytime work, what you do during the day. Lonnie just gave a great introduction and threw in there the Glass Lab. Can you tell us, like, what is that? What are you doing? And what does a normal day look like for you?
What a great question. So I'm here at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona, about an hour from Mexico. And I run this lab that does grief research. And I have wanted to do this. I've been in this area, in this field for 25 years now, and have really wanted to tackle all sorts of questions about how we respond when we become aware that someone so important in our life is gone. And day to day, I have graduate students, I teach undergraduates. It's a clinical psychology program, so I'm also teaching people who are going on to become clinical psychologists. I have colleagues and manuscripts with grief researchers all over the world. And honestly, we do neuroimaging scans. We're just getting started to do a new neuroimaging study, which is exciting. We do Zoom interviews in another study that we're doing of people trying to understand their experiences around support and what that looked like very personally for them. In any case, the real reason I think that I wrote these books was because I realized that I'm getting to do this every day and I'm learning so much. And I realized that what we're learning, what we're writing about wasn't really getting into the hands of anyone. If I sit next to someone on an airplane, they don't know anything about what's going on in grief research. And I realized I really needed to write some of this down so that people could have it in their own hands in their own home and read about it.
How do you all decide what you're going to work on there? You and I had an event in DC and I got to meet a couple of your graduate students. And what got me really excited as someone who relies on data is the fact that really you are one of the few people that's adding to this, what we need, which is the numbers and the understanding and the imaging about what happens to the brain and the body. how does it get decided? How many people are involved, and how long does it take from idea to study?
Mm. So it really comes from a variety of places. I realized that there was a fact that really stuck with me when I started this work, and it really had to do with the broken heart phenomenon.
Mm.
It was this empirical evidence from really population level studies that showed that in the first 3 months after a man's wife dies, he is almost twice as likely to die of a heart attack compared to a married man during that same time. That's an insane statistic. That's a medical risk factor that is just crazy high. It's 1.8 for women, so also very high for women. And that made me realize there is something physical going on, and we don't really understand what that is. And so when I came to graduate school, I really wanted to study what we might call psychophysiology, sort of what's the cardiovascular response when we lose a loved one, so that we could try to start to understand the mechanisms. How does that get under the skin? How does that get into our heart? And so I learned physiology. I learned how to do EKGs and take blood pressure and, do all the math to pull apart a heart rate and see which part is the vagus nerve and which part is the sympathetic. And I think because of my own personal grief experiences, it was comfortable for me to sit with people and let them tell me their story, their experience, and then try to match that up with, what we were seeing in the bits and bobs of the numbers, the data. Later, I went on to do neuroimaging studies, and then once I was a postdoc, we took blood draws and looked at immune factors. How I decide what studies to do is very much being steeped in an understanding what we know so far about how we physiologically react in other stressful situations, or what our psychological response is from a vast literature that's broader than just responding to the death of a loved one. And then I come up with hypotheses and theories as to why, not just what happens, but why is it happening that way? And then develop, how would I test what's happening in that way? And we use all sorts of things, right? I've used virtual reality. I've used those Atari joystick sort of things to get reaction time, to see the subconscious processing that we do. So it's always in conjunction with graduate students in my own work. So they also then bring in their ideas, their questions, their lived experience that helps to inform us. And more recently, I think the additional benefit of writing these books and now being involved in programs like FAN is that I end up talking about the science to a really wide range of people and hearing what their questions are. Sometimes I feel like the Google search engine for bereavement studies, right? Like people ask me a question, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I have in 2017, there's a study that, but more importantly, they ask questions that I don't know the answer to. They ask questions I didn't think to ask. And that has genuinely changed the way that I do grief research now. The questions that feel most important, thinking of the methods of how to try and test those questions that are the ones people have in their living room, in their bed at night, in their doctor's office.
What I love so much about this book, and you just gave us one of the most stunning statistics that's in there. I mean, I highlighted that, I, underlined it. You and I have talked about it before, but it's really staggering, right? What it is making the argument for is this notion that bereavement in general is a risk factor, right? A health risk factor.
Yeah.
So, and you have some other statistics in there that are so validating for grievers. You talk about how the percentage, I think it's like 90% experience some sort of pain in their chest, right? And so what I'm curious about is outside of your cluster of folks who are already engaged in this and interested in this, what what is it like to be bringing these statistics and maybe even just, a general conversation about the mind and the body being connected and that the stress of bereavement impacting the body? Are people up for hearing this? Does it just seem like total logic to them? Or are there some crowds that are still, difficult, still are going to want you to see a cardiologist, still are going to want you to see a vascular specialist rather than just accept that some of these are real standard experiences?
Well, it's interesting. I think, Megan, I would say sort of both are true, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think the first thing around science communication is I can cite you a statistic, and that still doesn't translate. What I'm saying is people do die of a broken heart.
That's right.
Right. So I can tell you twice as likely to have a fatal heart attack in the 3 months after the death of a loved one. But unless I also tell you the story, of Joe Garcia, whose wife was killed in the Uvalde school shootings and who himself died 2 days later of a heart attack, right? Like the statistics isn't the same as that story. And I will tell you, as I go on podcasts and so forth, I hear these stories over and over again.
Yeah.
I was on a podcast just the other day, and the woman told me that when her father died, her uncle went to give the news to her grandmother, their mother, and he knew that she was going to have a heart attack, and
Mm.
she did.
Mm.
So I think that for many people, they have a lived experience that fits with what this data is saying. It's also really important to quantify it in the ways that we do in science, partly because that helps our medical community to figure out, well, how do I use this information? And so I think one of the things you've really touched on there, Megan, that's important is if you are having heart pain, it could be a heart attack and we need to go to the emergency department,
Absolutely.
right? So it isn't just the sense of we have physical reactions, we have physiological reactions when we have loss, when suddenly our one and only is not walking into the room or getting into bed with us at night. The physiological reaction, it is normal for your heart rate to go up when you start crying. It's normal for it to come back down again when that wave of grief recedes. These are the normal ways that our body reacts and recovers, sort of the pillow, right? That sort of takes that in as we go through these waves of grief. But there are times and there are people for whom that physiological reaction gets outside of the bounds of what a human body can handle. And so by knowing that that risk factor is high, it's important to take those seriously and to go to the emergency department if we are having the symptoms of a heart attack, for example, because it might very well be a heart attack. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and what it's really like landing home for me is this idea that grief education, it has to be a cultural, it has to spread far and wide and fast, right? Because it's not just a doctor screening someone and saying, have you been bereaved,
Right.
right? Because you're going to go to the doctor for your regular checkup when you
Yeah.
go. But it's also that person knowing, oh, I
Yeah.
am actually at more of a risk. Because I think
Absolutely.
one of the things, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, I think we use the word stress.
Mhm.
And stress for a lot of people means their work. It
Mhm.
means, what does your work life look like, right?
Yeah.
And then we have sort of that culture of, oh, and you're also supposed to be doing enough self-care to mitigate the stress. What really hits home in this book is the physiology of the stress of bereavement.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can talk about, you just started to talk about it, but the notion of sort of what it means to be co-regulate with another person through attachment. Can you just open that up? Because I think that is so affirming to
Yeah.
people who do experience physical pain without the people around and who are totally disoriented. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think it's so important to remember we can't really talk about grief without first talking about love and bonding.
That's right.
Right? Loss makes no sense unless we also understand what's going on physiologically when we're attached to our one and only, right? And so in that sense, we know that when two people are bonded, when you fall in love with your baby or you fall in love with the person who becomes your spouse, that you become a we, right? You are no longer just you and me. Literally in the brain, you get encoded as a we. So we think of ourselves as sort of ending at the edge of our skin, right? That's me, I end here. But we know that the we doesn't actually work that way. That as relationships, we are co-regulating, meaning I'm an external pacemaker for my partner, and
Right.
he is an external pacemaker for me. And I mean, there's really obvious examples of that. When I get home tonight and he gives me a hug, my heart rate will decrease a little bit. My blood pressure will go down a little bit. Or, if I'm giving a talk, say, for example, let's say I'm nervous about it, and I think of him like cheering me on, I'll have that little extra surge of adrenaline that helps me to do well when I'm speaking. It is because we are bonded that he has that effect on my heart, on my cardiovascular system, and other systems as well. We're stuck on the heart at the moment, so that's fine. But what we see then, and we see this even in animal studies, that it is often only when one part of we is removed, when that person is amputated from our life, that it is suddenly revealed that we are not entirely regulating ourselves, that co-regulation suddenly means without that person, we're dysregulated. And
Yeah.
that we have to figure out how to reestablish all those biorhythms without this person.
And one of the things I hear from grievers is it isn't always about distress, that
Yeah.
there are, those magic moments when your kid takes their first step or they get married or they're, that they also experience that kind of yearning, but also that sort of sense of feeling lost
Yes.
without the person to affirm the good stuff. And you talk about some of that, but I think that the way in which you describe it, particularly here, is so affirming to people who do. And in the Grieving Brain, I think the magic of helping people understand that the brain is a prediction tool and that
Yeah.
the difficulty becomes uploading the new data, that this
Yeah.
person is no longer here. What
Yeah.
you're bringing us into in the grieving body is that that's also the body, that the
Right.
body is having to learn that they're going to bed by themselves, or the body is having to learn that there isn't a hug to walk into at the end
Yeah.
of the day.
That's right. That prediction piece, it's funny. I think of grieving as a form of learning,
Hmm.
right? So there's on many different levels. One level is just all of our habits are bound up with this person, right? So we're in the grocery store, you put the soy milk in the cart, and then you realize, oh, my daughter, who is vegan, who I buy the soy milk for, is no longer with us. I don't need to buy the soy milk. And just the habit of having done that so many times, you have to unlearn that in this moment. You have to learn that life is different now. Now, I mean, that is the minusculest of examples. So imagine all the millions of habits we have to relearn. When I walk into my aunt's house for Christmas dinner, my mother's not going to be seated at that table, right? And so that kind of learning has to happen. But the other kind of learning is like, well, it feels like they're going to walk through the door again, right? The ability to really know the impact on our life and be able to use that information to predict what is coming, I think is incredibly challenging. But what that means is, our brain is, of course, our prediction machine, right? It's trying to help us understand how the world works. And we suddenly find ourselves having to walk in this world that doesn't make any sense to us. But of course, our brain is also sending signals to the body of what to expect, right? Of what to expect in terms of when we will see them again and what our interaction will be like when we see them again and so forth. So all of those body signals have to change as well. Just as you said, when I get into bed at night, I have to figure out how to go to sleep without a text from them. I have to figure out how to sit down at the breakfast table and eat without them. Those are physical processes, but we are expecting that there will be our one and only as a part of that experience.
One of the things that I think is so beautiful in the book, and I'm just going to encourage our audience to particularly if grief is part of your story, which I might assume that it is, part of what you lay out by really digging into the physiology is the thing that we all experience, which is that we do miss them in the everyday and in the tiny moments, right? There is that like, oh, they're not here for the wedding, but that wedding only happens, one day.
Yeah.
Mostly the pain of what grievers are sitting with, which often is partly what is isolating for them because they don't know how to even talk about these minuscule moments,
Yeah.
is the thing in the grocery store. The grocery
Yeah.
store comes up so often for grievers because they hear a song there, or they see the shampoo there, or they smell the turkey there, whatever it is. It's the grocery store is the epitome of the thing that we do all the time just to sustain our lives. And it is a place where so much grief is experienced because the way that we miss the people is in the everyday way that we loved them.
Yeah.
And so there is a sort of a concept of like they are my attachment object,
Yeah.
whether or not I want that in this moment, right? The flooding and the triggering that can happen in a grocery store can be really discombobulating. I'm hoping, can you talk a bit about what happens, not just with the heart, but the physiology in general? And I'm specifically interested because I think it is something, well, I'll say it like this. I work with a lot of women in their 50s, and women in their 50s are coming into my office to tell me that they have recently been diagnosed with maybe lupus. They're not sure, it might be Lyme. They're not sure, it could be IBS, but essentially what they're talking about are the autoimmune cluster.
Yeah.
And that something, they've seen all the doctors and run all the tests, but something is going on and they're not really sure which specialist or which supplement they're going to take. What they're coming into my office because I'm a trauma therapist who specializes in grief and loss to work on their bereavement, their loss, whatever it is. And it isn't always a person. Sometimes it's the loss of a marriage or the loss of a dream.
Mhm.
Can you talk about autoimmune and inflammation and what we're seeing in terms of bereavement?
Mhm. I mean, I always like to give the caveat that, of course, it is important to seek medical care. That the general commentaries that we're talking about right here don't supplant an interaction with your doctor, which is the most important thing when you're trying to get a diagnosis. But another fact that had really stuck with me early in my career was that it isn't only heart attack that is increased in bereavement. It's actually what they call all-cause mortality. And so what we see is that for bereaved people, they have increased rates of COPD and diabetes and colon cancer and pneumonia, right? And I thought, well, that's not how the body works, right?
Right.
Like you can't have all of those systems affected at the same time. And then I started to think, in addition to the fact that we all carry around predispositions, right? So, of course, each of us has a system that's maybe less strong than the others. But in addition to that, I thought, what about hormones and the immune system? Those are two systems that affect every organ that we have, right? So the research that I did initially, which has now been done in much larger samples than what I did when I was at UCLA, shows that bereaved people have an increase in inflammation in their body. And so it's the same thing, in your joints when you have rheumatoid arthritis as it is in your lungs when you have asthma, right? That inflammation is going to affect any system and make it harder to deal with whatever it is that system is dealing with. So the immune system, though, isn't just one thing. Inflammation, certainly, we get in a lot of stressful situations. It's just that bereavement is considered the most stressful of situations. And in addition to that, remember how I said sometimes your body can kind of get outside the range of normal human functioning? So what we see, and I'm just going to give you a personal version of this because in some ways that makes sense to people. About a year, little over a year after my mother died when I was 26, I went to my doctor and I was like, I'm having these weird symptoms, doctors love this. I'm having these weird symptoms. Okay, what are they? I feel like my arms are twinkling. He's like, what? It was a she, actually. She was like, what do you mean? So fast forward, of course, through a lot of diagnostic stuff, which you were talking about. It turned out that I had developed multiple sclerosis. Now, to be super, super clear, my mom's death did not cause my multiple sclerosis. It runs in my family. I had mono as a kid. I grew up, in the northern latitudes where there was lots of risk factors. But it isn't surprising that in the context of that very stressful circumstance, that was when those symptoms really emerged, right? And so MS, multiple sclerosis, is one of the autoimmune disorders. So if you imagine that your immune system, actually, the main purpose of your immune system is to identify, okay, this is self, this is a self cell, I should protect that. And this is not self, this is something else, and I should get rid of that virus, bacteria, etc. But when our immune system gets very activated, sometimes it starts recognizing self cells as non-self and starts attacking our own body. In the case of multiple sclerosis, attacking myelin, which is the fatty stuff in your brain, or in, say, rheumatoid arthritis starts affecting the collagen, getting rid of collagen in your joints, or in type 1 diabetes, getting rid of cells in your pancreas that are related to insulin. So autoimmune diseases are exactly this, where the body kind of gets outside of the bounds of what we think of as a typical immune reaction. So the reason that I even sort of bring up my own sort of personal reaction is, A, it's important to take your symptoms seriously, even when your doctors don't. It's important to understand that you may not know right away what it is. But in general, we can learn to support a grieving body. We can try to learn to soothe our body to find comfort when we're grieving. And this physically helps us in all of the systems as well. And so I don't want to confuse people in the sense that it is important to identify over the long term what the diagnosis is or isn't. It may just be this is a transient change in my functioning, but it is also important at the same time to learn to do the things that calm our system as well.
Oh, God, that's such a good answer. It's making me think of I think it's a whole chapter you write about Lauren DePino, our friend who's the writer. You write about her experience with falling
Yeah.
after someone died in her family, and then she discovers that actually other members of her family were also falling. So one of the things that I think is so validating and magic, again, I'm going to encourage people to read the book. There's tons of details, and I think one of the things that happens when you're a griever is you pull out the ones that are most salient to
Yeah.
you, right?
Yeah.
But part of what you're affirming, again, if we just took that word stress, which everyone is comfortable using, like, right? I have a migraine because of stress.
Yeah.
Well, what is your stressor?
Yeah.
People are more likely to tell you that they have a deadline at work than they are to say, well, my dad died. In my work, I will often have someone come in and say, I've had these symptoms. I've had migraines. I haven't been sleeping. I have digestive issues for a year. And I ask the not so genius question of what happened a year ago. And they say, well, my dad died, but I don't think that has anything to do with it. So
Yeah.
part of what's so affirming about what you write about things like your balance being off, or
Yeah.
is that you are really with your science telling us, no, your body is impacted. We've always been comfortable by saying it's stress. But
Yeah.
now what we're saying is what's sort of the biggest stress? Well, a profound attachment loss is this
Yeah.
incredible piece that is so difficult. I don't know if I shared this with you, but after my mom died, I started swimming because I knew enough as a trauma therapist that I needed to move the energy through my body.
Yep.
I had no energy in my system. And you talk a lot about that. I want to talk about it in a second.
Yeah.
But I was really, it was urgent for me to try to move the energy through my body. And I was swimming and I got out of the pool one day and I couldn't shake the water out of my ear. And I ended up going to an emergency, one of those walk-in places. And they said, which is never what you want to hear from a doctor. And fast forward, I end up at an ENT, and I don't know, 6 months, a year before I'd had my hearing tested. So somebody had looked at my ears a year before. I'm in an ENT and he says, I don't know how to tell you this, but you have something that is that essentially it impacts surfers in Australia, 18-year-olds who spend all of their time in the water. You have surfer's ear, which is when bones, it's like a bunion in your ear, when bones grow across the canal of your ear.
Oh
But
my goodness.
typically they take around 8 years, 8 to 10 years to develop. And mine had clearly torn through my ears in some short, I mean, enough that doctors wanted to come and see it, which is again,
Yeah.
never a
Not
good
what you
sign.
want.
But
Right.
I remember saying over and over, could this be, my mother's death was so impactful. Could this be because of that? And they were like, no way. No way is that why. And I remember reading your book and being like, damn it, it's definitely why. That is why. And who knows, right? It does. Who knows that maybe that was always going to happen to me, but it's impossible for me not to believe that the stress of what was happening to my body didn't
Yeah.
also cause this extraordinary thing to happen the same way in this chapter about Lauren falling.
Yeah.
She wasn't somebody who was otherwise falling, and it
No.
eventually stopped.
Yes. And I think you make such an interesting and important point here, though. I think where people get confused is they're like, well, but it's because of the grief, as though that doesn't mean you still need to have your ears dealt with.
Oh yeah, I had surgery.
Right. Exactly. So I try to think of, this may sound like a strange analogy, but I think a lot about the analogy between bereavement and pregnancy.
Yes.
Right? So pregnancy is totally normal. It is absolutely a physiological experience, but it is not a disease. It is not a disorder.
Yep.
But it does increase the risk of a lot of regular medical problems,
Correct.
gestational diabetes and blood pressure and, and psychological things as well, postpartum depression and so forth. There's nothing wrong with pregnancy, but we also know it is a risk factor for these other things, so much so that we have created support systems that we actually have prenatal care to watch out for during this risky time. Is everything going okay? And if not, we will intervene on the diabetes during this period, right? So I think that it's an analogy that can be helpful. Grief is a natural, normal response to loss. The vast majority of us, statistics show, the vast majority of us, our physiology and our psychology, we do resiliently adapt eventually. We absorb grief into our ongoing life. It doesn't go away, but we restore a life that includes the fact that our loved one has died. And so it's only that we want to make sure that we don't get in the course of that stress response, that we don't get outside the bounds of what the human body can manage.
But I think also because people have not ever taken a class on grief and loss unless they are with you in the glass lab. And I say this because people don't always know this, that therapists are not trained in grief and loss, that it's very difficult to get training. It's not required. I took one class on death and dying when I was in social work school, and it was a movie. We watched a video and we discussed it. And I think it's important because what you write about is important because it's so affirming of people's experiences, and they didn't know that, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we hear over and over again, is people are like, God, I had no idea it was
Yeah.
this hard. And I think about other sort of subsets, things like bereavement leave.
Yeah.
You can't call bereavement leave 3 days. That's funeral leave.
Right.
We know that the physiology. And so What's happening with the sort of spreading that education out into the what's your role in that and even in things like asking doctors to screen for bereavement.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
Yeah. I think there is starting to be enough of a scientific base, a research understanding that we can start to use those statistics in useful ways. And there's the beginnings of evidence-based intervention that help us to see, okay, for this person, we need to do this kind of intervention. But you're absolutely right. Medical doctors don't get any training in grief and loss. Psychiatrists, psychologists, I had no training in my graduate career about grief and loss. And so I think, at baseline, we have to have just better grief literacy among the helping
Absolutely.
professions in general. But I think what's difficult is you don't have to be able to provide grief therapy in order to ask what has happened recently that you're showing up in my office with hypertension all of a sudden, right? But kind of more importantly, um, it's thinking about the idea that how are we going to support these grieving bodies, right?
Right.
So I think in my own experience, and I write about this a lot, especially in the second half of the grieving body, I really see this parallel. The grief when you have a chronic illness, the uncertainty of what each day is going to look like, or what your functioning will be like in a few years, that uncertainty, unfortunately, is something we have to live with when we're grieving. Is it going to be a really terrible day? Am I going to cry in the middle of my daughter's soccer game? It could happen, right? I am now a person. I love this that you say the candy coating shell has been taken off my heart. And so, what I think is important is we know a lot about how people navigate chronic illness where they don't know what their functioning is going to be like day to day. And to some degree, we can use some of those same skills when we're talking about grieving as well. So I'll give you sort of a simple
Yeah.
example. One of the examples that I've had hard-won wisdom around, because a lot of my symptoms with MS are related to fatigue. And so I have what I like to call the plan B. The important thing about plan B is that I make plan B at the same time I make plan A. So plan B is I'd love to go to the concert with you and out for dinner. But if I don't have enough energy that night, what do you say you just come over and we'll watch a movie? Right? And the reason that it's important to do it at the beginning is because A, it acknowledges the uncertainty of what your life is like. B, it gives you permission to not know. And it gives you permission to tune into what am I capable of once we get to that night. It gives everyone the heads up. It can mean that your friends get to have a conversation around, oh gosh, I didn't know you were doing so badly. And you to say, I'm actually doing pretty well right now, but I have no idea what next Thursday is going to look like. I don't want to not make plans with you, right? But I also want to be honest that I may not have it in me, right? So I think ways of thinking about how do I navigate this uncertainty of who I am now, of how I can function in the world is difficult. I wish we didn't have to do it, but are skills that we can learn.
What I love about what you're describing also, again, is the affirmation that the expectation is that you are going to need some flexibility. I often talk to people about not planning more than 3 hours in advance because you can have such a physiological, energetic shift in
Yes.
your, so saying at breakfast, yes, I'll have dinner with you at 7. That's just imaginary because you don't really know what what kind of energy is going to be inside your body. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about energy and a little bit about motivation? You write so beautifully about it, and I think it's what people experience and is really affirming to hear that it sort of bears out in your research.
It took me a long time and a lot of self-reflection, a lot of getting very quiet and listening to what was going on in my body. to recognize that there's a difference between having energy and having motivation.
Mhm.
Right. And so for me, I have difficulties with each of those. And it is often difficult to figure out, why do I not want to do this? Is it genuinely, I don't have the energy for it? Or is it that I don't have I'm not motivated to do it? Right. There's a weird way in which the death of a really close loved one kind of levels the playing field. You're like, there's a lot of stuff I just don't care about anymore.
Yeah,
I am
that's
just not
right.
willing to do.
You
Right.
get real clear.
You get real clear sometimes, much to the delight of your friends and family sometimes, but you can feel very clear about, I'm motivated to do this, I am not motivated to do that. Energy and motivation are very much bound up, right? So let's use the example of, I really should take a walk tonight, right? The question for me is, if I don't feel like taking a walk, is it that I'm not motivated to take a walk? Because that's a really different set of strategies to get my butt out the door than, I don't have the energy to take a walk tonight. And if I take a walk tonight, I'm going to pay for it tomorrow. Right? Now, right? And unfortunately, they're so bound up, right, that we have to get very good at how to manage that. So, for example, a technique that I learned is to start walking for 5 minutes, right? For 10 minutes. If after 10 minutes you have about the same level of energy, or you even feel a little more energized, you're moving now, keep going, right? But if you feel worse, you stop. Right? Because then it wasn't a motivation issue. Motivation is very much about the getting started. And energy is about being able to sort of have the budget, right? The energy budget to maintain that and to do that, and then also be able to do whatever else your day requires of you. So it's things like that where, the worst case of all is where I don't have either.
Yeah.
The best case of all is, and this is the irony, right? This is why I have this subtitle of, the stress of loss is an opportunity for healing, because you come to really authentically know yourself if you can allow yourself, if you can shut out all the messages, because it says to me, you know what? I know what I can and cannot do. I can make adjustments, right? Because my partner may want to take a walk, and we can figure that out, right? What's that going to look like? Maybe I bike and he walks, right? So it's not that you're not flexible in any sort of way, but it means that on a day that I have both energy and motivation, those days are so wonderful. It's such a gift. And I enjoy those days in a way that I never did before I had a struggle,
Yeah. I think you're talking about something that is so critically important for grievers to hear, because I think it is really startling to no longer have motivation when you used to not care about things.
Nope. Don't care.
Don't care about back to school night, don't care
Nope.
about the Christmas party, don't care, and can't make yourself care, and don't have enough energy to push yourself to care.
No.
And also to not have reliable energy inside your system. And to know maybe that it's good for you to take a walk, but not be sure that you're going to be able to take a walk. I think that's scary for people.
It is.
It's scary to have this terrible thing happen and then to wake up and not really feel yourself at all. Right. And there's an identity crisis around that. And there's also the pressure of people who are like, well, Meghan's really not doing well at all. And it's been 3 months since her mother died.
Let herself go.
Yeah, she hasn't even showered.
Right.
And it's very difficult to explain what it's like to live inside that body that feels that way. But what you're describing, and you actually talk about it quite a bit in your book, because you are also describing that when you lost your mother, the relationship that you had with her had a little, I'll use my word from the clinical, but a little bit of like a codependent space, not in the way that we use it in alcoholism, but in the way that we think about it. Like, I'm not just checking in with myself. I'm also checking, are they doing okay? Is part of how am I doing okay?
Yes, that's right.
And so that nature, I think, is very feminine. I think women often are sort of people pleasing. You ask them, what do they want for dinner? And they don't answer what do they want for dinner. They answer what they have and who else might eat it and what time soccer practice is. And the challenge in grief and loss,
Yeah.
it's so hard
Yeah.
just to survive that
Mhm.
you really have to also become an expert in what you just described, which is just experimenting with knowing yourself
That's it. That's
inside your,
it.
and it's for people who haven't done that really ever.
Yeah.
And I find this also with CEOs, people who push, 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 and
Yep.
they have a winning idea of themselves.
Yeah.
There's something about grief that feels like losing
Yeah.
because it is a loss, but they feel
Right.
like a loser in it.
Yeah.
That can really wind this notion of like, but what is the energy inside your body and what
Yeah.
are you able to do with it as really the gripping task.
Yeah, I think one of the most telling studies about this that write about in the Grieving Body is a wonderful study that was done looking at women who had lost their spouse, whose spouse had died, and looking at how they changed the way they eat.
Yeah.
Now, at the beginning,
Yeah.
many people describe not having much appetite. There are people who feel like they constantly need to eat. That's a slightly different thing. But many people have a lot of difficulty with appetite, with digesting food, and so forth. And what's so fascinating in this qualitative study that Vesnaver and colleagues did is that they looked over quite a long period of time. And what they found was initially, uh, women also, it wasn't just that they didn't have any appetite, they felt very disoriented
Yeah.
in the sense that in many cases, these were women who had cooked for the family, cooked for their couple, them and their husband, and they had developed the rules about what we eat and when we eat and how we store it and where we grocery shop over many years. When you develop that those rules, those systems around eating become a part of the we. And then when it's just you, it's literally disorienting in the sense of, I don't even know what I want.
Yeah,
Right? And
absolutely.
so what often happened was there was sort of a second phase in these widows' lives where they realized, wow, I am not feeding myself well. They had sort of a wake up moment or moments where they realized, I have to figure out how to do this now as me, as one person. And they solved the problems in a million different ways, right? Some of them developed ways that they would socialize as a way of eating. Some of them some of them turned to frozen food. They were like, you know what? I don't actually want to cook anymore. I am perfectly happy to eat this nutritious frozen meal, and that's what I'm going to do. But the gist was that for most of them, their appetite improved, as most of our physiology as we come to regulate improves over time. And within the first year, and often much earlier, but within that first year, for almost all of the women, they developed a new way of interacting with eating and cooking for themselves. And so, even if you go back to our question of like, what can medical doctors do? Right? Like, the idea that you would have this information as a doctor and you would see a woman 3 months after her husband died, and she tells you, I've lost weight, which you can see from the scale as the doctor, and she says, I have no appetite. Even just to be able to say, you know what? This is actually really typical. We see this a lot. We see also that you're probably going to have to develop some new systems around how you cook and eat and store food and shop and socialize with food. I want you to come back in 6 months, or if you lose another X number of pounds, I want to see you again. Because while this is typical, it should start to shift. And I really want to see you if it doesn't, right? That's a 5-minute interaction and is a huge gift to normalize and to provide follow-up if things get outside the bounds of normal.
The other there's so much energy, especially also for women around food.
Yes.
And so again, a lot of what I'm hearing from people in my own experience, my mom died over 5 years ago, and I still really struggle with having any hunger cues the way that I used to. But even the way in which people show up early on with pre-made food, right? And so here's the lasagna, which is very loving. I have heard folks who want to be able to eat the food, don't want to throw it away, don't, just a lot of shame when there isn't an understanding with what you just said, which actually landed with me again. Like, it is really normal for your eating to get real messed up. I always ask those questions. How's your eating? How's your sleeping? Are you managing? Like, what's going on? because those are the two symptoms that I hear about the most, is that their digestive tract sort of closes and that their regular rhythms.
Yep.
It's so important to also give that information that, look, you need to eat the macronutrients, the carbohydrates and the protein and the fat in order to create the other parts inside your body that will help you do the things like sleeping and be motivated and have
Right.
So again, just the core education and affirmation that you are giving is really critical. Before I know I'm watching the clock, and before we wrap up, can I get you to read this one section that I think is just, it's subtly one of the most beautiful descriptions of what the task really is for grievers. I gave you a little heads up about the chapter.
Yes, I've got it here.
But for folks who have their book, it's on 172 and it's protest and despair.
Yeah.
I just love this.
And this really, these terms, protest and despair, we see as behavioral responses when there's loss in humans. We see it actually in animals. We see it in infants who can't tell us how they're feeling, but we can see it in their behavior. I'm going to jump down to the second paragraph of that section. I have described protest as, oh no, they're gone? Protest includes awareness that the loved one is missing, which makes it distinct from utter disbelief. Protest means you are fully aware they are gone, and I refer to a previous example. On the other hand, I describe despair as, oh no, they're gone. Despair embodies withdrawal, giving up, with full awareness of the gravity of the loss. If you imagine feeling despair right now, notice how the energy of protest has drained away. If the evolutionary advantage of protest was to give you the energy to quest for your mate, your parent, your child, then despair transitions you to give up the search. There is an evolutionary advantage for this shift to giving up, which may point to why despair is also a natural response to loss. Running around searching for your one and only makes you more likely to attract predators. And if your one and only is going to be gone for a long time, conserving energy by withdrawing becomes more important. But despair also serves a cognitive function on the learning curve of accepting the painful reality of loss. Despair enables you to give up the costly search of protest, which is expensive for the body in all the cortisol and adrenaline it requires. Despair has a function, and its function is to give up a fruitless search. I know very few of us think of despair as being worthwhile or useful. For this reason, supporting and grieving people, both the experience of protest and the experience of despair, is important. Of course, despair is not the end of the story, because despair carries hopelessness. We cannot yet imagine that we could ever live a meaningful life given the loss of this important person. It's okay to allow a grieving person to express protest, to express despair. This is very difficult for us to do as individuals and as a society. We value the perfect meal, the happy wedding, the social media posts of cute pets and gorgeous sunsets. But if despair has a function, if it enables us to accept the reality of loss, which ultimately must happen in order to adjust to our new world, then accepting that grieving people will feel despair from time to time may be necessary.
That just gives me chills. It just gives me chills because the word despair is so provocative. It is so hard. You can feel the hopelessness. But when we're talking to people, and again, I think it's really important to say the book goes on to offer so much hope about what it means to become a griever and to move on and to have a meaningful life.
Yeah. I think, I didn't read beyond, but I think the last thing I would say about that is when we're the person sitting next to someone who's grief adjacent, so to speak, right? We can support them in feeling protest and feeling despair, the anger and blame and guilt and all that, and the despair withdrawal. It also means that they can't see the hope, they can't see a life, but we can tell them, I know it's not going to be like this forever. I don't know what it's going to be like. You don't know what it's going to be like, but I will be here with you while we figure it out together so that you get to that point where you don't feel this way anymore.
So good. It's
Mm.
so good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meghan.
Such a joy.
Whew, lots packed into that 54 minutes.
We like to keep it coming,
I told you we would.
Yeah, I didn't doubt it, even in the little bit of the 30 minutes we had together beforehand.
Mhm.
Meghan, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and engaged and lively and bringing both personal and professional insights. We really, really appreciate that. Mary Frances, you are just very dear to fan. Yes, thank you for noting that as Mary Frances, you're very dear to Fan. We're so grateful, and our community is so grateful to you for bringing your wisdom and being able to also communicate it in a way that is also, moves people forward. I mean, I really appreciate that. You're clearly extremely sharp. You're an incredible researcher. You know what you're talking about, but you also make things in very plain language, which I think people appreciate.
Yeah.
So couple notes for folks. So I want to remind both Meghan and Mary Frances will be at After Hours. After Hours is going to start at 8:05 p.m. Central. That's in about 7 minutes from now. How do you get to come and talk to these nice ladies a little bit longer? Is that we are, not us, but the bookstall, our partner is, you can purchase a copy of the new book, which I have right here, The Grieving Body. We've been putting links in chat the whole time. When you buy it from our partner bookseller, thank you so much. When you buy it from our partner bookseller, in the email receipt that they send you will be the link to register for After Hours. So that's how you get to come in. They'll spend another 55 minutes, ask your own questions, offer some observations. They are here to listen and help and more conversation. We had almost 20 questions came in during the Zoom registration form, and then during the event, a couple more. We have time for I'd like to maybe put in one here, though in particular, I'm interested in, Ashley had asked a question about the impact of AI and what a lot of people are doing with AI in terms of recreating loved ones, literally. They'll be interesting, maybe at After Hours, we can take a look at that. That's a little bit of a longer question. But I would like, maybe if you can cover this one piece quickly. Mary Lamb asks, have you done any thinking about the anticipatory grief that caregivers experience and how this impacts their brains and body?
Yeah. Anticipatory grief, of course, is a real thing. It is the grief that we're experiencing before a loved one dies, before a loss event happens. Interesting, there's a very old study from the 1980s about the immune system, which I would really love to see redone with modern methods and a bigger sample. But what's so interesting about that is it is clear that the anticipatory grief has an impact, say, for example, on cortisol, our stress hormone. But what is also notable is that the immune impact is different after the loss, right? So I think it's just a great example of how, our body doesn't have a lot of choices. Heart rate goes up or it goes down, right? But at the same time, there are ways to think about what's the right way to support. There's so much to do before a loved one dies, and you can see that that's physiologically different than after a loved one dies. Also very stressful, but there's not the same doing things. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Well, we're right at 8 o'clock. And like I said, Swiss train running on time. I want to thank everyone who came out tonight. The recording will be going out in the next day or two. Come hang out at After Hours. There is so much more to learn, so much more in this book, so much more research to talk about. We hope you'll join us. Hope to see you also next week. Robert Sapolsky, those could be fighting words. Do you think there is such a thing as free will? It's interesting, even among it's just been interesting talking to people about that program. That'll be Monday at noon. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. And Meghan and Mary Frances will see you in about 5 minutes. You get a little break in between.